The truth.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Internet Herald podcast. This is me, Reese, your host, and I'm joined today by our guest, Lily Goodman. Lily, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Lily Goodman, and I'm a master's student at George Mason in Fairfax, Virginia. And I just am really involved in activism and raising awareness, and I'm happy to be on here today.
Awesome. It's good to have you on. So before we started the show, we talked about some of the stuff you were involved in, and you said one of those things was modern day slavery, right, or human trafficking, fighting it. And it's something I'm passionate about myself. Something I've been researching and I've been working on since I was in high school and making projects on it. So, how did you find out about modern day slavery, and how did you get involved in combating it?
Well, it kind of stumbled across my path. I have been modeling since I was 2 years old, and I was selected for a Department of Homeland Security ad campaign in January of 2013. And it was just a regular modeling job. I had really no prior knowledge of human trafficking before that, as I was only 13. And while on set, given that it's such a sensitive topic, and I was at the age I was at, they had representatives from Homeland Security there who took the time to explain to me really what human trafficking is and how prevalent it is, not only in America, but also in Virginia, Northern Virginia specifically. And aside from that, in the modeling industry, which I had been involved in heavily, it had been a really big problem and still is. And so they took the time to explain all that to me. And after the modeling gig, I had an assignment for school that was to talk about something I was passionate about. So I brought this up and became involved through that essay with an organization called the Models Alliance, where I helped with them to pass a law in New York to protect child models who are really vulnerable with the protections that they had at the time back then. There just were really no protections. Girls could be there underage without a chaperone at all, without hardly any restrictions. It was the worst level of no restrictions for child performers in New York. So it made for a very unsafe environment and made human trafficking very likely for girls who came overseas or just didn't have parents who wanted to be involved. Right. And so after that, I just performed a lot of local activism throughout my years in Richmond with the Richmond Justice Initiative and other local nonprofits to raise awareness of human trafficking and fight against it by hosting seminars and awareness-centered fashion shows.
Awesome. So I have some statistics which I pulled up earlier. So this is from, I think, it's called Slavery Today and slaverynow.org. And it's estimated that there are probably somewhere between 21 to 45 million enslaved individuals today. Most sources which I saw say that it's probably like 40.3 million, right? Which is, I mean, to put that into perspective, like we have more people enslaved today than we have ever had in human history.
Yeah.
And the thing is, these people are involved in a lot of ground level industries, which are then later on involved in the production of other products. So almost most products that we have today at some point were touched by like a slave, and therefore inherently we're kind of, in a sense, with our dollars supporting that system.
Yeah.
Right. So let's come break it down to say just to the modeling industry, because I know even within the modeling industry there's been abuses or moments of slavery effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So like, have you ever come across like any perhaps someone within that industry who you think was probably suffering through that type of situation, or you may have heard about it or something like that?
Yeah, so I personally have not had any friends who have, fallen into this sort of trap that's set up by like sham photographers and sham agents and stuff. But I have read lots of stories and heard from some individuals who have experienced it. And it really comes from, like I was saying, the sham photographers, sham agents, people pretending to be scouts, even trying to get you a job that's maybe your dream job. You've always wanted to work with such and such company, and they make it sound really legitimate, and you go there and it's not what you expected. And if you go alone, and as a woman, a lot of the times you could easily be taken advantage of and even trafficked. So that's how it really starts. And specifically in the modeling industry, I think right now what's needed to prevent this would be some sort of platform to identify legitimate people in the industry who are legitimately trying to do business without any of this injustice going on.
Right. So, I mean, I think one thing you pointed out there, right, especially regarding to women, because the thing is, it's about 70%, or actually 71% of this industry of modern day, enslaved peoples are women, and then a quarter of them are children.
Yeah.
And actually, what you talked about earlier with the New York bill about kids basically not having that protection, I wonder how many times that loophole was exploited until that bill came into existence. And like, I know you talked about, like, for example, Northern Virginia, the DC metropolitan area being one of those places where there is a big slave rink, and that is true. But once again, like, especially in dense urban areas, there is just this high probability of individuals living in slavery, including New York.
Mhm.
And it's one of those things, right? Like, the United States, I mean, you can't really critique just the United States because this is a problem for pretty much every country on earth, right? But the thing is that we are in the 21st century where we have had centuries of, I guess, abolition struggles, right? And fight against civil. I mean, in the United States, there was a civil war over it, right? And despite this, we are at this situation in history, or at this point in our current modern history, where you know where we have this situation where there's like this injustice, which I think is the worst of any injustice, right? Because to trap someone into slavery basically means that they become a tool completely and are not an end within themselves. It's it's just multiplied, and it's more. It's just so prevalent in pretty much everything, right? Like, for example, like this phone I have here. Like, I know there were slave labor involved at some point in the manufacture and the production of this phone, whether it be even mining, whether it be in actual the putting assembly, so on and so forth. So what would you say is the best possible way for individuals to try to ensure that they're not actively participating in the system and contributing their dollars to it?
Well, like you said, I mean, that's pretty hard considering how intertwined it is with our daily life nowadays, and the way in which corporations hide how much they're actually contributing to slave labor. But I think doing your best to research companies prior to purchasing items and seeing, like, are they really involved in slave labor? How involved are they? And trying to buy from more ethical places if it's possible for like the individual. Because I know more ethical places do come with a higher cost because people are actually being treated fairly. However, I think the biggest way that anybody, no matter what position they are in, to purchase any item would be fighting against corporations and their exploitation of people, because that's really the root of the issue. It's the people who are owning corporations who want to cut costs so they can produce the most profit without actually being just in their actions. So I think that's the best way that individuals can really fight against this right now.
Right. I guess one objection that someone might raise is, well, like you said there, right? So something which is produced fairly probably is going to cost more. So what if someone is living, an underprivileged life, and but how would they go around not participating within the system while still being able to, be able to afford their basic necessities?
Yeah, so I think right now that's really hard. And, for people who are living an underprivileged lifestyle and can't afford it, I think, you have to do what you have to do to get what you need. And unfortunately, sometimes you might have to support organizations that you don't really agree with their values. But as long as you're working hard to push against them doing unjust actions like supporting slave labor or having just dirt cheap wages that aren't livable and other sorts of injustices. If you are pushing against it, then you're doing what you can.
Right. So, you know, I guess the question which ultimately comes down to everyone who because something like political activism is something which I feel like most people are attracted to or at least pay attention to, right? However, it's difficult for people to be able to realize whether they're having an impact from their activism. Now, in your case, for example, there was a bill which you were able to pass or help in passing in New York, right? So you have some sort of barometer, like, okay, this particular thing that I did have an impact. But what about everything else, right? Like, what about other causes which you believe in or which you're supporting? How do you measure your impact within that cause or within the system which you're able to cause?
Yeah, so I think with your impact, you just have to keep fighting and doing what you can. You're not going to make the biggest difference in every single topic that you care about, but you could pick a few and really fight hardest for those and still spread awareness about other issues. I think just raising awareness, one of my phrases that I like to say is awareness is key to solving any sort of form of injustice or human rights issue. People like to be ignorant sometimes because then they don't feel compelled to do anything. And then some people just don't know what's going on. And if you brought awareness to them, they would be happy to help. It's spreading that awareness and doing what you can to make sure others know what's going on in the world so that they can feel compelled to help. That's what's going to make the difference because you can't do everything as one person. You have to reach out for help into and spread awareness to others so they can start doing their activism work too.
Right. Do you think that awareness is sometimes weaponized?
I think maybe sometimes, but you just got to reach out to the right people. The right audience is going to want to help. And the people who don't want to help aren't going to help anyways. You got to focus on doing what you can and focus on the people in your circles who actually want to make a difference and push aside all of the criticisms you're getting.
Right. Now, with something like modern day slavery, right? Like, it's very black and white, I would say, in terms of, like, I would say like 99% of people would say, yeah, we are against this, right? But there are obviously topics which are important in society, right? However, they're much more gray. They're not as black and white, right? So in that case, like, how do you deal with a topic like that, right? Like, I guess, for example, right? For example, I think a topic which is prevalent today in American society uh, is probably gender discrimination, right, on both sides, right?
Mhm.
And it seems to be an extremely controversial topic, and I understand why, because there's so many different factors at play. Also, you have to remember there's like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of reform and movement, and then so when it comes to modern day slavery, the issue is obviously very black and white, right? Like, about 99% of people would probably be against it. However, when it comes to a lot of other topics, such as, say, the gun issue, or such as even just like gender discrimination, and like the different, because there's just so many types, and there's so many levels to that topic, right? And so much history, and times of progression, regression, and even those are kind of subjective, that it's just there's so many there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of different strings, a lot of different narratives, and also a lot of people who are trying to who use it as a political weapon to be able to gain seats, or not even just as a political weapon. I mean, you see companies using it as a way to be able to appeal to certain demographics more. So when a topic is more grayer, then how do you suggest people go about navigating the awareness which they may gain within that topic.
Yes. Okay. So I think that you need to be skeptical about what you see on the internet. You know, it's great to see graphics online, but do your diligence and fact check, look up the topic and read several articles, maybe even go on the next page of Google to see actually, okay, is this legit? Like, what are the sources saying? Try to find a really good website, news source that you trust to make sure fact check. I think it really lies in our hands to make sure the information we're taking in and the awareness that's being spread is factual, because the media does not want us to know the truth anymore, quite frankly. We have to dig for it. If we want to find something that's factual and true information that has not been messed with, then we have to do our own work to do so. And it is a little bit time consuming, and it does complicate things when it comes to awareness. But unfortunately, that is the position we're in right now. And until we can fight back against false information spreading, then that's what we have to do.
So when it comes to which one, when it comes to like facts, right? So all right, let me back it up. Yeah. So facts are basically things that we're able to observe ourselves, right? Like that's the most like dictionary definition of what a fact is, right? Obviously, a lot of times you would have people writing articles, people who are trying to be fair and be objective, and they're trying to write about situations which they themselves cannot observe, but they're reading about it, they're collecting information on it, they're even reading research papers and trying to figure out what's going on. But because they themselves cannot observe it, it's very difficult to say that they will be accurate, right, or that they will even be precise, right? So, but they probably do have good intentions. The issue is that effectively what we have today, right, is that that's kind of like your best researchers are people who are not really on the ground per se anymore, because
Yeah,
it's expensive to be on the ground, right? And that stuff is something which is relatively in the hand of the big media houses. And as we know, like the big media houses are going to cater to basically an echo chamber rather than try to be objective, right? So
exactly.
how do you then, I guess, trust those sources, those reliable sources, or find information yourself, because you yourself are probably not going to be able to observe everything within a topic.
Yeah, so I guess looking for more independent news sources is always a good way to go. Free press, different, like your public television stations where people can actually bring their opinions and what they want to say without restrictions. A lot of media prevents people from actually reporting on what they want to say and makes them either sugarcoat or change things to fit the narratives they want to put out. So I think that's a good way to double check. And like I was saying before, fact checking, it's just the best thing you can do. Really searching hard and thinking objectively about the positionality of the person creating the media. What's their position? Like, are they upper middle class? Are they, poverty level? Are they black? Are they white? Like, what race they are, what nationality? All sorts of factors can affect how you perceive situations. Even when you're not even trying to be biased, everybody has a bias. So, your positionality and the positionality of people reporting things is important to recognize.
Right. So recently, right? So actually, not even recently now. It's been several years. This has been going on for, right. We've had the movement of social justice probably for about, basically, I think I would say the 2010s were effectively defined by the social justice movements, right? However, despite all of these things that were going on, we still seen rise a rise in modern day slavery levels. I think back in 2013, the estimate for how many slaves there are in the world was probably somewhere around 20 million, maybe 30 million at most. And now it's risen all the way up to and this one is from 2018. So from 2013 to 2018, that's about 5 years. The new estimate is coming at about over 40 million, right? And it to me, it was kind of like it was an iron. It was a weird, like a strange thing to see on TV. Obviously we had people marching for Black Lives Matter, for example, right? But then they were recording these videos, and they were wearing probably wearing t-shirts and clothes and using items which were probably made by slaves at some point, right? And I know it's not that these people are doing that on purpose. It's just it's so prevalent that you can't, a lot of times you just can't help yourself, right? But it, because I mean, we are such a socially conscious society now than we have ever been before, and despite that, we see these slavery numbers just continue to rise, right? So how why is this problem not on the forefront of your mainstream thought, and why isn't this something which we're seeing as much activism behind, or at least by seeing, I mean, like, at least what we by perception of what we what is loud, as I was to say. Why are we not seeing that type of support behind this, which is so something so clearly, which I would say most people would agree is wrong, and by most I mean almost everyone, versus something which is a lot more grayer and has like different dimensions to it, or perhaps something which is related to this, but for some reason it's like it's almost like it's promoted, and it should be promoted as much as it is, but at the same time, like, the reason for the whole Black Lives Matter movement, if you really think about it, is because black people were enslaved, right? And that's why we have the issue that we have today. However, once again, like, even today there are black people who are enslaved, a lot of them. I mean, if you look at the continent of Africa and you look at just how many slaves are just within Africa, or the fact that slaves are being sold to Europe or sold to the world in Libya, I mean, it's insane. It's massive, right? And despite this movement, which is trying to protect, right, which is trying to bring awareness to the issues faced by the black community, right, ultimately the root of it is in slavery, and despite that, that particular topic is not as prevalent as you would think it would be. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that that's a really good question. And we are existing in a system of late stage capitalism where the corporations are pretty much corporation owners, politicians, and military personnel consist of the power elite. They make up the power structure that we all are pretty much under. Media is controlled by that too. So what we're like being fed in terms of information is what those three groups of people want us to be fed in terms of information. So that's a real barrier to spreading awareness. And we don't have too many forms of independent media. If you look at statistics, I'm not exactly sure of the statistics, but I think only 7 major corporations own all of the real big media outlets in America. And that would need to be fact checked, but I'm pretty sure that that's what I saw last, which is really concerning because then we can't have access to free and fair information, and issues that are really prevalent can't be pushed to the forefront of people's minds. Um, and I think, as you were saying, like a lot of people are forced to kind of submit to this system where they want to buy certain items. Well, most items are at some point um, pass through the hands of somebody who is enslaved currently. And that's a huge issue that's also related back to our system that we're stuck in right now of late stage capitalism. We have these greedy corporation owners who want nothing more than to increase profit, even if they're mega billionaires, then don't even have an idea what to do with the money that they currently own. They want more of it. And when we are in a system where money is valued above all else, even human life, there will always be human rights violations. There has to be, in order to combat this system, there has to be some sort of benefit for not creating human rights violations, which for right now, there is a huge benefit to creating human rights violations, which is getting more money. So we're really in a place, in a system where everything, our values conflict with what we're being told to do, what we're being told to do through work, through all aspects of life. It's really infected all aspects of life.
Right. So then I guess it transitions to my next question. Then, what do you think is the state of human rights globally in our current day?
Yeah, I think this is a mixed question. I think definitely things have gotten better in a legal sense. However, there have been a lot of loopholes created to get around these laws. And because the people in power currently, the people who hold most power, sure, not every person in power is ill willed, but most of them are. And they really enforce the policies that we have. And when we don't have policies that are loophole proof, and when we don't actually punish corporations, we just charge them fees, which they can easily afford. What is the consequence to causing human rights violations to a mega corporation who can afford any fine and go to any country and do anything they want?
Right. I think, see, the issue I have with like policies, and especially what you said regarding loopholes, is that every time there's a loophole, right, you try to patch it by creating another policy. But the issue is that like 90, like majority of the time, you cannot see all the consequences of that new patch, and what it ends up doing is just ends up creating more loopholes usually, right? Or it ends up creating a law which just no one likes at all. It doesn't work for anyone, right? And because ultimately, right, the idea of one of the key pillars in democracies is compromise, right? Like you're bound to have those loopholes. You're bound to have things which just make everyone meh, but not really like happy or stoked about, right? So like how do you how do you suggest we create like I suppose a better system to try to either fix those loopholes or perhaps mitigate them better? Like, is there a better system than what we have currently with how we go about making policies and fixing those policies?
Yeah, I think, well, one, the criminal justice system is obviously very corrupt. And so it's really hard to actually hold people accountable when they've done something wrong in terms of like corporations, because most of the time they know somebody who knows somebody who can, cut them off short with their sentencing or make sure that they're just fined, which they can easily afford. So that's obviously one way to avoid loopholes. From corruption prevents these policies from being foolproof because people can just get around it through knowing someone. On top of that, having just fines be a consequence, I think, can sometimes be really, really detrimental to seeing actual impact because sure, individuals might see a fine as super detrimental and such a huge consequence because it's an individual. But a multi billion dollar corporation sees a fine and thinks, oh, that's my easy way out. And so that's another issue. And then a third issue would be how we have, especially in America and in other countries, corporate personhood, where corporations have more rights now in America, I know for sure, and in other countries too, than humans themselves. So corporations can get away with a lot more than actual humans, which shouldn't be how the system works. So I think that there's a lot of corruption that prevents these policies from actually working and makes those loopholes than just the policies not really working themselves.
Right. Yeah. See, the issue with corruption is that a lot of time corruption arises when organizations get too big. Because the thing is, when an organization is small, it cannot really afford to have inefficiencies. So corruption is kind of like naturally just mitigated by just the market, basically, right? and this doesn't just go for like businesses. This also goes for governments, right? Like, the bigger your government is, the more chances, the higher the probability there is of you having a few bad eggs, right? Who start breaking that system apart. And the thing is, I think that corruption multiplies. I think that if you have one corrupt individual and other people see this person getting away with, corruption, they too will likely take that slack more often than not, right? And then eventually, the more they get away with it, the more, the more it perpetuates, and the more they're gonna do it, and it grows exponentially from there, right? So for things like what you're suggesting, right, where basically, right, we have more, I guess, policy, I suppose, more diction on, and more enforcement of corporations, right? With these big, large corporations who have those inefficiencies, right? To do that, you would also need something, a large organization, whether it be government or independent, to be able to combat that. And once again, right, you kind of you get the same problem that we have today, right? Because like the reason our government became, I guess, one of the reasons, because there's many reasons why the government became so big as it is, right? One of those reasons was because we had to regulate corporations, we had to regulate businesses, right? Which makes sense, right? However, then it led to, okay, well, here's 10 guys who are regulating my business. Okay, now there's an 11th guy who has joined in. Guess what? I can probably talk to this guy because he's actually a cousin of mine, and I, rather than getting jail time, I'm just gonna get a slap on the wrist, like, give me $100,000 fine, right? So how do you suggest, I suppose, we create incentives or create some sort of, maybe a small solution, maybe small patches, which can go a long way in either fixing our existing systems, right, or at least fixing one of our existing systems, or perhaps which organizations, whether it be independent or government, could maybe look to implement to try to mitigate that corruption, to try to, I mean, because it's bound to happen, but try to limit it as much as possible.
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing as people who like want to actually promote a just society today. Because corporation, if you penalize them too much, then they can just go to another country that has leaders that aren't going to do anything about the violations that they are, doing. So that we're really in an awkward position in time where corporations hold so much power, they can just leave, uproot their entire business, and go somewhere else. And so we're really in a position where it's hard to enforce any policies on corporations because if you upset them too much, then they're just going to go somewhere else. It's like you have to walk on eggshells around them because you don't want them to leave and take all of their profits with them, but you also want to prevent further injustices. And so it's just a hard game of tug of war, honestly, right now that's being played. And we need to find some sort of way to make sure corporations have to benefit individuals. If they're not benefiting human society, then if they're hurting human society, then they need to be disbanded. But it's really hard to do that with the way the world's set up at the moment and how much power they really have, these mega corporations.
But if you were to disband that corporation, wouldn't that be the same consequence as them just leaving and going to some other country?
Exactly. That's what prevents so much action from from happening at the moment because it's really hard to actually enforce policies that are going to make a difference when if they get too upset they can just leave and they know that they have this power and they exploit the fact that they do have this power and just keep racking up the human rights violations. And that's, back to your question on where does the globe stand on human rights. It's gotten better in the legal sense, but the more these corporations get greedy and the more power they get, the more they can do with that in terms of exploiting people.
Do you think now that because of the internet, people have the power to combat these, I guess, bigger organizations, or do you think that no, not really, because it seems that government and organizations are now a lot more involved in regulating the internet?
Yeah, so I think that's also another, back and forth issue. Nowadays we do have a lot of people on the internet, and a lot of people specifically on social media and different platforms where you can communicate with somebody across the globe about a similar issue you guys are facing. And that has inspired so many global movements and created real change in terms of, like, for instance, with the Black Lives Matter movement, there wasn't only a movement here in America, but also in places all across the globe. And so that really shows how activism can travel because of the internet. But on the other hand, corporations do have lots of power and can spread false information, and even countries themselves can host bots that just flood the internet with fake information. I know before the election, this past election, Russia had a lot of people hired to just be bots on the internet and spread false information. And so these are things that are conflicting issues. And so I think that there's never a black and white answer for how things are going in terms of human rights, because there's always somebody trying to fight against it and there's always somebody trying to fight for it.
Right. I see. One of the human rights is, I would say, is the right to speech or responsible speech, right? And the internet, to some extent, especially in the early days, was the perfect place for that right to be expressed, right? The unfortunate consequence of that was that we started getting these like extremist groups on across the political spectrum, social spectrum, religious spectrum, you name it, right? And some of these extremist groups, especially the fundamentalist ones, you know, we did have negative consequences of society, and we're still seeing that to this day, right? For example, I think there was that one car which killed a lady in Charlottesville during a protest, for example, right? Like those things. I'm not going to say that that person was directly influenced by whichever online group they were part of, but I'm sure there were probably some group online which was, at the very least, a minor influence, right? And so on and so forth, right? You can just give a bunch of examples like that. So, what's the balance between free speech and, I suppose, being able to combat the more extreme side of things?
Yeah, so that's another hard question. I think that it's hard to limit free speech if you want for everybody to be able to say what they need to say. Because once you start limiting free speech, then that leaves an example for bad politicians with ill wills to follow and prevent free speech that is trying to incite positive change. And so limiting speech is a really difficult thing to do. And I think that at the end of the day, it's easier, it's better to not limit free speech if you want for positive change to occur.
Like you said, right? Like, so you're saying that we should be a world more geared towards free speech, right? And that, yes, I agree with you that if you start limiting it can lead down to a domino effect where you basically get to complete what's called sedation. I think that's the word which is used for it. So, like, but at the same time, right? Like, it's difficult to deny that because of if you have complete free speech, right? Like what we've had on the internet for a long time, not so much anymore, but definitely what we used to. You get these like extremist pockets, right? And they do have an effect on the world. I mean, for example, like I think some of the terrorist organizations, some of their primary recruitment areas was the internet, right? So, like, is there, I mean, is there, or I suppose, is there responsible, like, are corporations or government, do they have responsibility in perhaps some sort of regulation or some sort of method of preventing that happening, or should they just allow the free speech to happen and just kind of like monitor, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think both options are good. I think what we have right now on certain platforms, for instance, Twitter during this election, for an example, was deleting tweets that were just blatantly false information from very, very important political figures at the time. And so that was a very socially responsible way to handle this misinformation spread. And I know different social media platforms have policies against hate speech and policies against bullying and other forms of using the internet in a negative light. And so I think these policies are really good. However, we do have platforms like the dark web and websites on the dark web where um, people can, bypass all of these restrictions. And, dark web websites change their their website link often.
Their IP. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So, but the thing is, like, with Twitter being able to, put in the label of possibly false information or just deleting something if they think it's, it's completely just wrong. The thing is, like, we've seen Twitter, and I think a particular example I'm trying to remember is in India, where I think there was a police department which tweeted something about a case they were working on, and Twitter said possibly false information or something, and then they had a response. They basically, I think, sued Twitter because they were like, "Wait, how can you say this? This is an active investigation going on, right?" Um, so, like, I think what if I'm trying to remember this correctly, but I think in India, and I think there's a few other countries who are trying to look at something like Twitter, and they're trying to give it regulations which say a newspaper would have or any like media company would have, right? Do you think that social media companies are now in the same sphere as say something like the New York Times, right? Or other media companies, and should they be given like that same responsibility, perhaps the same regulations as those companies? And should they be held to the same? I suppose should they be held to the same accountability level as say traditional media?
I think that it would be ideal if social media was more accountable in terms of information. However, because it is more of a consumer based platform and for the people, written by the people, I think that it's hard to put that level of accountability up there because things spread on Twitter aren't just information, but it's also people's opinions and, even just funny jokes. And so things like that are hard to hold to an accountable level, like the New York Times. So no, I don't think it should be held to that level because it's very different. New York Times is something someone reads for news and expects to be something that's accountable. But on the internet, I think it's pretty well known nowadays that you just can't trust everything on the internet. And I think then that really comes back to people being more responsible for what they're feeding themselves from social media because not everything you read can be trusted. And so you really need to do your due diligence and fact check. And I think that needs to be something that's promoted more, individual fact checking. Not enough people do that. And so then we have people believing all this misinformation, or they'll fact check using their confirmation bias and not try to look at other sources that don't confirm what they're looking for.
Right, right. But see, the thing is, like, even though de jour you would say is that social media is like, right, it's just social media, right? It's like a town square basically, right? And the same thing, right? You would say that de jour people have more legal rights today, but de facto they don't really, right? And de facto you would say that social media is basically where people are getting most of their news from, right? Like people are no longer really going to the New York Times unless the New York Times is on Twitter. You know what I mean? Or even like a lot of people I know who get their sources from independent journalists, but a lot of these independent journalists are just people on Twitter, right? Like individuals, and so even though yes, like theoretically it's just a social, like it's just a gathering place of people and like their thoughts and their ideas and their writings, but in reality it is ultimately serving as like the modern newspaper, right?
Yeah.
So it's like do you think then there's some possibly some ways of government, and you have to also remember, like, these at this point, a lot of these social media companies are major big corporations who have probably one of the most direct impacts on society because they literally control the information, right? So do you think then, because of all of these things, do you think there is an argument for possibly some sort of regulation on it, or do you think no, it's still because ultimately, right, because of freedom of speech, because of the principle, they should still have that free speech.
Yeah, so I think it's probably a mix of the two. I think because of we have free speech is a human right, even if that speech isn't going to contribute to social justice movements, it's still a human right. And I think that protecting free speech is very important to maintaining um, for social justice to occur, because when we start to inhibit free speech, then we can prevent social justice from occurring. However, I do think that, like you were saying, it should be the responsibility of these social media outlets, or if they're not going to take the responsibility into their own hands, the responsibility of the government to enact regulations to make sure that these sites have some sort of this could possibly be false information tagline under um, things that have false information in it. And that's hard to go through all the tweets. They're not doing that. They have AI doing this, which isn't smart enough to know everything from being true or false, especially now since the truth um, is kind of debated nowadays.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think that there needs to be more awareness from the government that individuals really need to do their due diligence and fact check themselves, but there also needs to be warning labels on some sorts of social media posts saying this could possibly be false information, with links to multiple sources instead of just one fact checking source, um, with possibly correct information.
Right. Right. Or possibly just links to sources which suggest which are the reason which caused this AI or this person to think that this may be like conflicting or possibly falsified information.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And so I suppose, like, ultimately, right, like, we can talk about human rights, but ultimately I suppose it doesn't really matter if we don't understand, like, where these human rights are originating from, or why why they're coming. So where do you think human rights originate from, and do you think, is it a natural quality of humans to have these rights, or do they extend to other entities beyond just humans?
Yeah, so I think human rights are both learned and natural. In the natural world, even with animals, it's natural to try to help out another person, but also as a child, there's certain things you learn, like sharing and such, that are human rights that are just learned, and that make us special as humans because we have this care for one another. However, I think it's really hard for people in power to act like they respect human rights, because greed takes over and money becomes more important. And so I think nowadays it's really like an unlearning that greedy corporation owners and just individuals affected by the capitalist system we're in, to unlearn these tactics to be just to another human. And it's just like I was saying before, when we're in a system where money takes precedence over human lives and others' rights, then it makes it difficult for people to act in a just way. It doesn't make the decision to be nice to another human easy, because there's this big benefit over here, whereas you might lose out on that just by being nice to someone, where some people who are in a position of power don't see being nice to someone or acting in a way that's just to be worth it.
Hmm. So, say for example, right? I think we can say that it's a human right, say, not to be abused, right, or not to be forced into doing something they don't want to do, right? But we the thing is, we kind of push these things on, say, like an animal, right? So, like, I'm sure like an animal probably doesn't want to be put in a cage and then be eaten up, right? Or we put it on, say, other life forms, like, say, a tree, right? I'm sure the tree doesn't want to be cut down, but at the same time, you can say that it is kind of a human right to be able to pursue, your economic interests, right? To try to basically be able to make a living or be able to survive. And sometimes you got to eat that animal, right? To survive, you got to be able to cut down your tree to basically, have your job, make furniture, have firewood, so on and so forth, right? So, like, do these I suppose, like, these universal rights that we have for humans, do can they extend to beyond humans, or should they just be limited to humans?
I think to an extent they should extend beyond humans. For instance, one huge driver of greenhouse gas emissions is the livestock industry. And if we decided to treat animals, specifically livestock animals like cows, pigs, and chickens, with more just behavior, then we could prevent some of the global warming that we're feeling now. And so and same with trees. To an extent, we need to respect these things over earning more profits.
Right.
And so I
So,
think that being in a system that emphasizes profits over everything else is what's driving the increase in like human rights abuses.
so do you think that those rights should be extended only to other things beyond humans if they are somehow a benefit to humans? From the examples that you gave,
Yeah,
that's what I'm
so
talking
I think that's a hard question. Definitely there's I would want to say treat everything justly, but at some point, someone's got to eat. If they all they can afford is to get protein from an animal source, then it's kind of hard to, protect animals, because some forms of like plant-based protein can be somewhat expensive, or some people really do need more meat in their lives, or else they could experience health risks and such. um, that's just one small example. So I think it's just hard to extend it so far because we aren't even treating humans justly. How can we extend it to animals when people are still being abused? And so I think what we first need to take care of is humans. And that doesn't mean that I don't think animals and plants and all life forms on earth are important enough to have rights, because they are. But at some point, we need to protect humans first. And we're not doing that right now. So,
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think that's a perfect note to also end this episode on. So, yeah, I appreciate your time. Appreciate you coming on. Is there any organization or any links you would like to plug in?
um, yeah, I guess I'll plug in the Model Alliance. That's the organization that I worked with to pass the law in New York on for child model protections, and they're a great organization.
Awesome. We'll have a link to it in the description below, along with all the other links. Thank you for joining in. Thank you, Lily. And yeah, we'll see you next time. And before you go, though, make sure to leave a rating and all the other stuff. It helps us grow. And yeah, thank you for joining us. See you.
Yeah.
The truth.